We have our Building a Foundation panel. I'd like to now welcome Chris Casey to the stage for our last panel, Building a Foundation, Innovation Born from Technology. Chris Casey is an experienced leader. Don't worry, Chris, I have something long for you here. Experienced leader of leaders and general manager in the technology sector, okay? With over 16 plus years of experience. Chris has a proven track record of launching, leading, scaling technology and data businesses globally. Today, Chris' role at AWS is as the worldwide leader and general manager for AWS industry software and data alliances, in which he is responsible for strategic partnerships with industry software vendors and data providers whose primary intellectual property is specialized to industry vertical buyers. Welcome, Chris. Thank you. You're welcome.
And we do actually have a panel, so let's bring the panel up. It's not just me. But thank you very much for that warm introduction and welcome. Yeah. I was actually going to shorten the bios for my panelists, but now I feel like I'm doing them injustice by doing that. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you everyone for attending today. We're super excited to be with you. We are under no illusions that we're the last panel between some awards and some drinks, so we'll make sure we keep on time here. But I'm super excited to be joined by the panelists that we have up here today, mainly because when we're thinking about building from the foundation or building on a foundation of technology, and we're going to talk about the concept of centers of excellence today. Each of the people on the panel here today have actually put that into practice. And so we really want to impart on all of you here today some of the lessons learned from that, some of the best practices, some of maybe the areas that we can improve on next time through each of the experiences that each of these panelists have done using Encore software as part of their solution in their center of excellence. Just to quickly introduce the panelists to each of you. So John Napoli to my left. John's the Chief Operating Officer and Head of JPMorgan Chase's Chief Technology and Data Officer's Strategy, Governance, and Execution. John does a whole bunch of other things also at JPMorgan, but he also manages the firm's low-code center of excellence, which is primarily why he's here to talk to us today about. Next to John is Susan Rousseau. Susan's the SVP of Enlightened Partnership Management at State Street Bank, where she's responsible for the strategic direction, growth, and performance of the Enlightened Productivity Program. And next to Susan is Gary Bigley. Gary's a member of the Data Ops Engineering Group within the Data and AI team at BlackRock. And in addition to Gary's roles within that organization, he leads the Process Automation Center of Excellence at BlackRock. So before we get started into some of the questions that I have for the panelists, I just wanted to sort of level set with the concept of a COE. And it's actually something that we've seen quite extensively within cloud migrations from enterprises over the last decade with AWS. And so when we're thinking about centers of excellence, we're thinking about people who deeply understand the technology. They're able to distribute and usher best practices across an organization. They're able to provide governance, but they're importantly empowering the organization to move fast, show incremental value and results, but also maintain the required level of control that is mandated in today's corporations. And all of that might sound great to you in theory, but the people next to me have actually put this into practice. So why don't we start with Gary, if you don't mind, if we start with you and the Process Automation Center of Excellence at BlackRock. If you can just talk to us about what was the challenges that you were trying to solve, and just give us a sense of the structure of your Center of Excellence.
Sure. For BlackRock, we started about 5 years ago, and it started with RPA. So our Center of Excellence has been growing up for about 5 years now, starting with RPA. And I think this is where everybody starts, is most of us anyway, task-based automation. The foundational elements of our COE are really, it's centralized and federated. And so by centralized, there's one at BlackRock, there's not more than one. I know JPMorgan, I think you guys might have some pockets. But anyway, we're one, and it's federated. And by federated, I mean we actually have citizen developers and citizen engineers participating on the journey with us, to the tune of in excess of 300 to maybe as many as 400 now at BlackRock across all of the different technologies that we federate, which for me right now is 3 of them. It's Blue Prism RPA, it's Abby Flexi Capture, which is PDF scraping, and it's Uncork.
Great. And Susan, turning to you at State Street, talk to me about like the COE you've established. What's the model? What's the framework around it? And what business challenges are you trying to solve?
Sure. Our digital team is embedded in the business, and we did that so that we could be close to our front office operations and onboarding teams. And we have the technology, all the build, solutioning, and all the initial testing is done in our team, and all of the data integration and QA testing is done by our technology team. We have teams across China, India, and the US, and we also have some partners like our Infosys who does some staff augmentation for us. And it's worked very well in terms of the challenges that we were trying to address. We really needed a faster way to develop. Everyone's interested in lower cost. We also wanted a way of doing targeted solutioning, and that's what Uncork really helped us out tremendously with. So we wanted things not over a 2-year span, but we wanted things that we could develop, reusable frameworks that we could build upon for other similar business challenges that we had.
Cool. And John, lastly for you.
Yeah, sure. So, very similarly, so what we've done is we've established a center of excellence, which basically provides, within technology, that provides support for the overall platform. And then, as alluded to by Gary, it's a pretty big company, about 250,000 people, and it's global and complex. So when you think about the organization, there's 4 banks, there's finance, there's risk, there's HR, and everybody already is supported by an enterprise technology. And so it's pretty big. We're about 56,000 technologists, about $14 billion in tech spend. But there's a lot of things we don't get to. So you think about the thousands or even hundreds of thousands of manual processes that exist, they'll never get kind of covered by enterprise tech. So what we've done is we've built this federated model where within each of the lines of business and each of the corporate functions, there are teams that are out there that are and by the way, they know the process better than anybody. So they're there, citizen development, power users, kind of getting stuff done and automating, and they don't have to necessarily rely on their enterprise technology completely to then get stuff done.
Cool. This is going to be a question for all of you, but Susan, I wanted to start with you. When we're talking about process automation or even some of these centers of excellence, is it a myth that some of those business processes have to be, in the edge cases and maybe not some of the critical workloads for a financial institution like State Street? Like, is it ready for prime time, and have you actually implemented it in prime time for some of the real core business processes you have to run the bank?
Sure. I think it's absolutely ready for prime time. I think just because you can build faster doesn't mean you're building less sustainable solutions. We built an end-to-end onboarding solution that's used by our, several of our business lines, and we're reusing it to go across about 5 different business lines. And that's worked very well, and it's from point of sale all the way through opening the trading accounts. We also have a couple of solutions that we use in our FX business. We have an exception trade hub. We have some regulatory solutions. So we were really building very much mission critical systems and solutions. So I don't think it should be, I mentioned we had a targeted approach to how we developed it, but the solutions are really, regular scale solutions.
Cool. You have anything to add?
Sure, yeah. So the core of what the offering is in terms of the very easy to build user interfaces and the establishment of kind of workflows that tie a lot of things together will sit in simpler use cases or even very complex use cases. It is a continuum though, so what we see is as you start to get more complex things, and we do feel that every single, a lot of use cases can be applied here, we tend to maybe get more involved with enterprise tech as more of a partner. So one of the tricks when you deal with low-code workflow, or for that matter, any intelligent solutions, is the integrations, right? So they become more and more powerful as you get access to the underlying deposit systems or whatever other repositories you have. So as you start to build these more complex things, you will get more partnership from enterprise technology. But once you build those integrations, what's really cool about this stuff is you can then re-leverage those and re-leverage those. And so one of the things we do within the firm is when we built our first 10 integrations for our low-code workflow space, we said, all right, just based upon these, what other 100 use cases could we actually go after without then involving enterprise tech? So yeah, we definitely see that.
And Gary, I think one of the unique aspects of your COE is one of the centralized aspects is tech selection within that COE. Can you just talk about how you balance that with obviously empowering the developers and how you manage tech selection within the COE?
I have a story. I think Terry's there. I was sitting beside him last night at dinner, and he said, I was telling him who I was, and he said, oh, so you're the one when the business has an Uncork app to be built, they bring it to you, right? And I'm like, no, we don't do that. The whole idea behind what we're doing in the COE is that we want to understand the business need. We've got a full stack beyond Uncork as well. So it's all about understanding the business need, and my team will figure out what's the best solution. So you need to really be careful about automating a poor business process and making it faster, right? So my team provides all of that service of understanding what it is you're really trying to solve for. And then there was another panel out here that said, oh, wait a minute, sometimes the best thing is to not do it, right? We'll figure out what's right for the client and what's the right technology to use, and then deploy with that.
We've talked a little bit about speed for development, I think, a few times. John, maybe a question for you. At JP, how are you tracking like success or value from some of these projects, especially when it starts to get super federated? Like line of sight on that also becomes a bit harder.
Yeah, so one of the challenges we have, and we have a large operations organization, and we have all these manual processes, and so when we started to roll this out for the firm, we would get questions from the heads of operations like, well, do we really trust people within the business to actually do their own coding? And so what we said was, well, first of all, it's probably better off than you doing it manually or doing things through email. And so having this actually in some place that's auditable is probably much better. But we also don't just let people kind of just go out and have at it. And so this is really an extension of things we built for other intelligence solutions, whether it be RPA or things like Altruis or visualization tools, not to kind of mention the names. And so what we've done is it's very much, we have two things. One, we have a control framework that we put in place. So if you're a software engineer, you have the SDLC, and you're very used to doing things like testing and scanning and deployments. If you're somebody who's doing something like a visualization tool, or in this case, low-code workflow, you may not. And so what we've built is a control framework that manages all of that and says, here are the expectations of you as somebody who's now using a much more powerful enterprise tool. We then leverage a kind of end-to-end kind of facilitated, orchestrated process to say, as you come in and we decide that, yes, this is the best tool for you because there are a lot of options, we say, are you trained? And if you're trained, then we're going to give you access. And then we partner with our federated partners to say, okay, as we go through, we make sure that they're keeping an eye on things. And then I also have a dedicated risk team that does two things. One, focus on the platform itself to make sure it's all the things you would want to do or as embedded as possible, so to make sure that this is as elegant as possible process. And then secondly is also looking at the different workflows being built to say, are they doing the right things from a data, from an overall process perspective? Sorry, long answer.
No, it's good.
I know I'm standing in the way of drinks, so.
We've talked a little bit about one of the favorite topics in financial services, like regulation and compliance. How do you manage that in the innovation that's coming out of the COEs? I mean, Susan, you've got an interesting structure with some of the Q&A and data integrations with a nice handoff between your team and some of the other teams. How are you thinking about compliance, and how have you managed to get those compliance stakeholders on board with how you've implemented your COE?
Yeah. Similar to John, we have a SDLC practice. We've got a playbook that we use, and we adapted it for low code and zero code tools and platforms. But it works very well. We did not cut back on our disciplines for how we did software development. What we tried to do was do it faster. And we met pretty extensively with our technology audit team so we could make sure that we would have things in place. We didn't want to lose any credibility, so we did it up front. So we built our playbook with them, working with them closely. And as I said, yes, we segregated our testing, which is a good practice. So we've gotten through many clean audits, which is always good. So we have the auditability, we have the things you need to have classically. We use Jira, we use classic tools, so it's worked quite well.
We've been trying to push off audit, but they'll get to us eventually.
There you go.
Gary?
I agree with Susan. It's all about that framework and having the playbook. For us, we call it the ROM. It's the robotic operating model. As I said, we started with Blue Prism, and Blue Prism kind of started this industry about a decade ago, and they built that ROM. We brought that in, and it sits on top of our existing SDLC. So it's actually additional controls that we have, and then we've modified that to fit what we need. So we'll include stakeholder sign-off, and there's all kinds of extra things that are part of the upfront process, the pre-work, so that we can then allow an end user to go out and actually develop. It's the framework that gives us the control. And like Susan, I just passed and got a clean audit too. So it works. It works. When you have that, when you put the controls in place, it works.
Cool. I think some people maybe conflate COEs with like shadow IT, and there's maybe some fear, uncertainty, and doubt there. John, you want to take that one? Like, what guardrails have you got in place to prevent sort of the...
Yeah. And so Paul Walker kind of said it before, where there's really what is a technologist versus not. And so I have an MBA, but I also Master's in Computer Science, so I can do a little of both, although I haven't really coded in a long time. So and the people who sit in the business, they don't want to wait on technologists to actually have to tear apart their data and look at things, do analysis. And so it's just a very different world. And so, but to some of the points we've made, it's all about making sure that we give them tools that are very elegant, and it could be SDLC and stuff underneath. But as much as that's automated and hidden from them, the complexity of that, it makes it much easier. So we just spend a ton of time making sure that the solutions are somewhat bulletproof and that we give them the power, but also we do have those guardrails in place, ideally embedded in the technology itself, and then if not, just very clear process, and then making sure that some people are coaching them throughout the way, and that's really through the federated model. So,
Susan, I mean, you've got a globally distributed team doing some of this too. Do you want to expand on what you're doing at State Street with regard to that?
Yeah, I would say this came up in a couple of the other panels, the walls that sometimes emerge between tech and business teams. So we specifically embedded in the business because we wanted to break down those barriers and get them kind of co-located, although in a COVID world, nobody's co-located anymore. But it was, so we were concerned that we might have some issues with that perception of being a shadow IT. But what I would say that in all my prior worlds on jobs, the teams that got rated the highest from a technology were the ones that co-developed. So we wanted to walk away with delighting our business partners, but do it in a way that was safe. So we didn't want to do macroids on steroids. We wanted to really do it in a controlled way. So it really goes back to that framework we're using. I would say there's still some folks that are naysayers of putting technology into the business, but it's really worked well, and because we've had some momentum and had some successes, you just build upon those.
Cool. And we touched on regulation and compliance, but security is also another area. The security of the applications that you're building. Maybe Gary, starting with you, how do you educate the teams on that, and then how do you sort of implement to make sure you've got security best practices throughout?
It's all about partnership with my InfoSec team. We work with them all the time. Obviously, they work with Uncork to bring it in and help us get it set up, turn on single sign-on, all of the things that you want to do with them. But one thing that we've also done, and I think it's expanding that partnership, is that every single app that we've done in Uncork so far, and we've done about a half dozen, it goes through a full InfoSec AppSec review, kind of like a mini pen test. So we are really making sure that the apps are solid. And InfoSec will look at the RBAC and all of that setup for us and basically give us a blessing.
Cool. Maybe to broaden this out a little bit, if you had your time again and you were sort of talking to yourself however many years ago when you first started to do this, what piece of advice do you wish you would have received when you were establishing your first Center of Excellence to start building here? And maybe what was it's probably the same answer here, but what was like a pitfall?
Sure.
John, you want to start?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is make sure you understand the operating model and you establish an operating model. I mean, the technology has really come a long way and it's really ready now, I'd say, so that the interface and being able to leverage it, we've proven time and time again with use cases that we're there in terms of the local workflow space. But what you have to understand is there's a lot of things around that in order to empower it within an organization. And so, more specifically, there's a few areas I'd call out. So one is the risk and control space. You definitely want to make sure, as we've couple questions to allude to that you have that really nailed down. Not just because you have to do it as good practice, but people are going to ask and people get nervous, and there's always, when you tend to sell it. And then the last piece I'd say is also the go-to-market organization. So for us, it's you have this great thing, but people are heads down. They're used to there are cultural changes that have to happen in these organizations, whether it's adopting the cloud, whether it's adopting AI, ML, and the whole move, we alluded to it, to no code or low code is a big change. People aren't used to it. So say, yeah, of course you can go build that thing yourself. Why? You don't have to wait 6 months and go try and figure out some budget for somebody else. And so having somebody who helps go to market, tell the stories, do the right training is critical.
And do you have a team that's doing that?
I have a dedicated
internal
team.
sales
Yes.
team?
Yeah, exactly. And again, you think about our organization with over 70,000 operations people globally, they're out there and they're selling it. But also it's a little bit of, it could be too much success, right? So if you think about the thousands of possible use cases, that's where the federated model comes in. And so it's going to be those people in the business who say, these are the highest priority things to focus on. By the way, we're not just going to automate what is a bad process, we're going to optimize those processes. So that's kind of the way it works.
Cool. Susan, what about you? Piece of advice to yourself
Well, actually,
4 years ago?
what Lars mentioned earlier about the requirements and having a longer backlog, I will say that we noticed that definitely was sort of an obstacle for us, was that we were actually developing faster, but we didn't have the requirements ready, so you get this lull. But so the benefit of how we were structured is that we had enough going on in parallel, so you can actually redeploy your folks. But I would say that the requirements gathering, actually, because you're developing faster, you can get to that point where you kind of hit a wall. You don't want to let those folks sit idle, like in any good development shop. So I would say that the more you can get those requirements ready, you can iterate much faster.
So you actually ran out of business
We
requirements?
did. Well, we just couldn't get the business to make those core decisions. We were doing a lot. I mean, the transformation we're doing, I'm sure everyone is, we were changing the business process. So in many times we were driving standardization. We had a lot of solutions that were siloed, and we were trying to get to a single standard. So that did take a lot of business decisioning. So at that point in time, we could kind of shift people over to do something else and then come back when the requirements were ready. That's a good problem to have.
Yeah. Gary?
So being on the end, you get to
You hear all the best? Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with Susan. One of the things that we put in place was a business process redesign process and model. Could run from anywhere from 1 to 2 days to a full week. We put everybody in a room together, not just the business, but I'll also bring in some folks like maybe risk if I think that that's an appropriate group to have in there. And when you get their business requirements downright, it helps tremendously. Other tips that I'd recommend, focus on that robotic operating model, the framework, make sure you get that right and put the controls in place, and start small. And one of the things that unfortunately we had to do with Uncork is start with a very large app. I think they would say it's one of their larger ones. We had to start with that. The only reason I was able to succeed with that was because of all of the framework that had been built, and we were just able to adapt to the new tool.
Talk a little bit more about that large app, and maybe if you had your time again, you would have started smaller. Was it just so complex and it took so long that it was hard to prove value, or was there something else within it?
It was incredibly complex, I think, and I know for those that were participating yesterday, my customer actually spoke and talked about this. It's extremely complex. My boss, who's right there, just described it last night as saying, hey, this is an ocean of spreadsheets, PDFs, and manual processes to the tune of hundreds and thousands of these. And what we had to do is basically digitize all of that and create quality control checks. So I think we're the first one, and Gary, you can tell me, I think we're the first one to build a QC engine with Uncork. And so what this does, and I'll use the really simple example, when we all started keeping our checkbook, at least I'm older, I remember this, I would get a bank statement and I would have to balance to it. And then the next month you'd get the next bank statement. The ending balance and the starting balance of those two statements had better match. And that's a quality control check that we actually put into this application, because the fund admins would give us a report for a client, and then the starting balance of the new report would not match the ending balance. And who's going to have to answer that question? It's BlackRock. So we help all of those fund admins to make sure that the data stays straight with this pretty extensive application running hundreds of thousands of quality control checks every month.
Maybe one question, starting with you here, Susan. If there's someone in the room that's part of an organization where this isn't embedded as much as it is in these three, how would you recommend that they get started? Like, what would be your piece of advice to them to like get started on this journey of a COE and potentially like using codeless as the foundation to build from?
Sponsorship is key, so you've got to find some folks, particularly on the business side, but also on the technology side. So depending on what angle, if you've decided to embed this low code into the tech or into the business, either way, you've got to get folks that really believe in it, because as you come out of the gate, there's going to be these preconceived notions. So I would say sponsorship is important. I also, when we built our team, I was very intent on having technologists. So 70% of my team, like I had a software engineer who led my COE, and then the rest was about 30% was business, because the whole idea here is to build better solutions, co-develop. So I would say bring in people from the business, bring people from the technology areas, and build it together. So just that sponsorship and those quick wins, you can continue the momentum, so that if there is any preconceived notions that it's not going to work, you can overcome that quickly.
And the business sponsor, what was the hook that got them?
What was the what?
What was the hook that got them in?
Well, they actually had experience. We had a wonderful sponsor, Nadine, so she had worked with the tool previously and low-code environments, so she was a huge sponsor, so that really paved the way, particularly when you were going up against some folks that were not as supportive. So just the sponsorship was crucial.
Gary, what would be your advice to someone who's trying to get started?
One thing I wrote down that I want to say is that if you're thinking of going out and federating and doing citizens, think about monitoring and support, okay? So example, if you let an HR person go out and build an automation, and that's going to kick off at 3 o'clock in the morning, you don't want to have them build a monitoring team to support that, right? So one of the things I did is I built a monitoring and support team centralized for all of BlackRock in India, so that HR and finance and legal and compliance, their jobs are all monitored by my team and supported by my team centrally.
John?
Sure. So I would say start with one use case and prove out the model. And so as part of that, a few things. One, you have to really set yourself up for success before you go forward. And the reason for that is people are going to be looking at this. And so when I say set yourself up for success, there's a few things. Make sure you pick a use case that has good business value. Make sure that you're not going to know how to do this the first time around, right? So leveraging something like Uncork Services to hold your hand the first time you go through it or Sherpa you through it is really important. Now, over time, you want to build out capability internally, but there are going to be experiences they have that you would traditionally stumble across. And then being able to make sure you include, last thing, enterprise tech. And so it sounds a little bit, counterintuitive, but the reality is when you first do these things, you do need those integrations in place. Mm-hmm. There are parts of the process that aren't going to be established for a low-code workflow organization. So making sure you kind of do those things, and then you can go back and say, hey, look, we built this quickly. Look at the business value. We of course included enterprise tech and let them know what was going on. We then have something to build upon. And then what ends up happening is, and what we're starting to see is you have this situation, we have a little bit of slow growth in expenses, but you see this exponential growth in value, because you can say on an annual basis, look at these 100 different use cases and look at the value they're creating. But in terms of the overall expense, it's somewhat flat. So,
awesome. Well, I want to thank our panelists for today. There's definitely a consistent sense of urgency across the organization. Thank you very much for your time.